Okay. Next, I wanted to ask about the Kaiser Aluminum Hour.
Okay.
Um, Before we even talk about the show you wrote, what was Unit 4?
Unit 4 was a group that was put together by Jerry Hellman, who was at the time Ted Ashley agent. It was Fielder Cook, Frank Schaffner, George Roy Hill, and Worthington Minor. And they formed a company called Unit 4. And Tony Minor, who had been the original producer on Studio One before Felix Jackson, Tony Minor sold the idea of an episodic anthology series to Kaiser Aluminum. And Unit 4 produced it. That's what Unit 4 is.
And
And you want to talk about the show?
yes. Okay.
I was asked by Frank Schaffner to write the opening show. And I told him it was going to be about a faith healer. And he said, fine, and I outlined the show. But the, excuse me, the advertising agency turned it down. And we had an air date. We had an air date for the show. I think it was July 3rd, 1956, something like that.
Yes, that's right.
And suddenly we didn't have a script, we didn't have a story. And so we called a meeting, and I called in a friend of mine who I'd grown up with in Chicago, Mayo Simon, who had recently moved to New York. And we had an arrangement. I said, whoever gets the next job will bring in the other one. Because I had already had shows on, but Mayo had nothing. So I said, I have another story. I want to bring someone else in to help me write it. And I brought in Mayo, and I told him the story that was really based on experiences that I had had in the Army. And they said, yes, let's do it. Mayo and I wrote the story together over a weekend. We outlined it first, and then he picked scenes and I picked scenes, and then we switched, and I rewrote his scenes and he rewrote my scenes, and then we jointly just polished it, and that's the show that went on with Paul Newman.
What was the name of it?
Army Game.
And what was it about? And what was how did you adapt the actual incident into this fictional?
The actual incident was a group of friends from the same area of New York City were drafted into the Army in the Korean War. One man was sort of the golden boy. He was the star athlete, he was the star scholar, and all the other people in that group looked up to him. And basic training was going fine until we got to a rifle range. And once we got on the rifle range, this one guy went berserk when the rifles started shooting. And at first they thought it was some kind of tick or something, and they'd send him to the doctor, whatever. But it turned out that one of his closest friend overheard him on the phone saying, it's working. He's going to get out of the Army by faking this mental illness. And once that word spread to the other people in the platoon, they made this guy such a wreck that by the time he did get out, he really was destroyed. And that's the story. That's a true story, and that's the story of Army Game. And Paul Newman played that part.
What do you remember about Paul Newman?
Paul Newman, that was early in his career, and my impression of him was that he was trying very hard to be Marlon Brando at that time. And during the rehearsals, he was very much within himself. He didn't seem to be interacting much with the other actors. on the dress rehearsal, which was done at Toscanini's studio at NBC, and finished a half hour before the live show. He was totally brilliant. It was spectacular. He was not quite as good in the on-air performance. He peaked a half hour too early, but he was very effective. He probably remembers it most because in one scene he had his fly open, which is another thing that happens in live television.
Well, let me ask this now. In your shows, were there on-air? Do you remember any on-air mistakes? Any things that went horribly wrong? We talked about the Rice Sprout song, but are there others?
There was a show I did called The Blast in Centralia #5 for Seven Lively Arts, in which this was a sort of recreation based, done totally documentary style of the Centralia mine disaster in Illinois. And this was in a small studio. We had 23 sets, 75 actors, over 80 scenes, tiny little scenes.
Now that's not the usual for live television, was it?
No. But George Roy Hill was not the usual director for live television either. I mean, his capacity for organization was spectacular. As a matter of fact, I had a good friend who was in the business of designing cockpit instrumentation for jet planes and for submarines to make the information flow between the human operator and the machine as easy to assimilate as possible. And I had him in the booth, in the director's booth, watching George direct that show. And when it was over, he said to me, "That's the closest thing I've seen to flying a jet airplane." And I said, "Well, George was a jet plane pilot, so maybe that's why." But it was quite a job that he did.
How did that show come about? How did that come to be?
It came about because, first of all, the story was written in Harper's Magazine by a very prominent magazine writer named John Bartlow Martin. And John Houseman was the producer of Seven Lively Arts for CBS. And he had read the piece by John Martin, which had won a Pulitzer Prize, and decided to do it. The first thing he did was hire Shad Norshield, who I spoke about earlier, Robert Norshield. He hired him to go to Centralia and shoot $50,000 worth of film before he'd ever gotten a script. Then he hired George, and then George asked me to come into New York and speak to him, and he told me about it. And he said, "Would you like to write it?" And I said, "Well, I have one caveat." I said, "People who've worked with you before tell me that you rewrite everybody." And he said, "Yes." And I said, "You have to make an agreement with me that no page of script goes to an actor unless it's come from my typewriter last." And he made that agreement, and that's how I got to do the show. But then, of course, I wrote the show, and I wrote it exactly as it happened, insofar as our documentation could show us, with the real names and everything. And in a snowstorm in January of 1958, several weeks before the show was to go on, I got a call. I have to come in to talk to CBS and the lawyers. Came into the meeting. John Houseman was there, Judd Kinberg, his associate, George Hill, myself, and then a CBS lawyer who said, "On page 1, you have Mine Manager Brown. You can't use Mine Manager Brown." And I said, "You mean we have to change the names?" And he said, "I'm saying on page 1, Mine Manager Brown can't be Mine Manager Brown." An hour later, we were on page 17. And finally, George just stood up, put on his coat, and walked out. And I walked out with him. We walked down the hall to the elevator. And the lawyer came running out after us saying, "We can can work this out. We can work this out. And the secret, and John Houseman never said a word, but John, in his sly way, knew that CBS would have to evaluate what the possible lawsuits would cost them against the $50,000 that they had already spent for the filming. And so they decided to go ahead with it. It was the fact that he had Shad Northshield do that filming that really got the show on the air.
They'd already spent the money. Can you talk about how you wrote to that documentary footage?
Well, the documentary footage actually took up about 45 seconds of the film. It was nothing, but it was the location and two brief interviews, I think, with miners. That's all it was. So I didn't have to write to that at all.
Would you say, was that a sort of documentary type of approach to that material that you took?
It was really put together like a drama. Just one scene after another, bang, 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 and it's such a story of corruption. And what we did at the end to satisfy CBS Legal was we changed the names, and we changed them in a way that it would become very obvious. First of all, the coal company had black in the name, and the governor of Illinois was Governor Green, and the mine manager was brown, so we shifted the colors around. And the only other name we changed was John L. Lewis, and we gave him a totally false name, and you saw him testifying before Congress in a little bit at the end, and we called him something else, so everybody knew that we had to change the names.
Tell me about the narration.
I was able to use a lot of the narration from John Bartlow Martin's story, because not from the printed story, but from the tremendous amount of handwritten notes that he had compiled when he did his research. The only research I could do was really on mining and how it worked, and some vague knowledge of Illinois politics from when I was a kid. But John's notes were very good, and we had Jason Robards Jr. doing the narration, and his buddy Maureen Stapleton playing a miner's wife. It was very affecting. And at one point, John Crosby comes in. I don't remember now how he came in. He was a television critic at the time.
I think he was hosting that show.
Oh, maybe.
What was the Seven Lively Arts?
Seven Lively Arts originally was a book by Gilbert Seldes, who I mentioned earlier. And it was a critical review of arts in America. And John Houseman sold to CBS a series of 10 shows called Seven Lively Arts. One was produced by Ski Wolf. It was all about jazz. And they were on all different subjects.
Can you give me a quick sketch of John Houseman as you knew him and interacted with him on that show?
John Houseman, I felt, first of all, he was very English in his manner, although he was not an Englishman. I think he was born in Belgium. The first time I met him was after George had picked me to write that show. I went in and sat down, and John said, "Would you like some tea?" And I said, "Yes." And he had someone come in with a silver tea service, and there were 3 cups, one for John, one for Judkinberg, and one for me. And he said, "How would you like your tea?" I said, "With milk and sugar." And so he poured for the other 2 just black. He said, 1 black, 2 black, 1 civilized. And he was extremely smart and very clever in letting you make your own mistakes. We remained friends. He wrote kindly about me in his book, and then in later life in California, I got to know him pretty well. When he was dying, he sent out about 200 letters to friends, saying in a very gentle way that he was going to be dying soon, and if you wanted to speak to him or see him, now would be a good time to do it. And I went out to California right after that letter, and I called and spoke to his son, and I said, it was a Monday, and I said, I can come home and see John tomorrow morning if he's up for it. They had moved his bed down into the living room in Malibu. And he said, all right, and then he said something to John, and John said he wanted to speak to me. And he came on, and his voice was totally different. It was very high, and he always called me dear boy. And he said, oh, it will be wonderful to see you, dear boy. Please come. And so I said, I'll see you tomorrow. The next morning, I called, and his nurse answered, and I said, is John up to my coming out to see him? He said, they just took him to the hospital. And so I think he died 2 weeks after that, never came back from the hospital.
Oh, that's a shame.
So I didn't get, I remember once a conversation with him when he was doing commercials for, I think he was doing one for Plymouth. And I said, John, how could you do that? And he said, feathering my nest, dear boy, feathering my nest.
You know, originally, first thing I asked you about that show was about things that went wrong on the air. Were you thinking of something?
Only that one actor, I can't remember his first name, his last name was Reed, and he played a bureaucrat in the government, the head of the Department of Mines and Minerals or something like that, and he totally blew up. He lost his lines on the air and somehow stammered through, and it got covered up. But that was the only other time I can remember.
How would you compare Playhouse 90 to the other dramatic anthologies you'd written for before, prior to that?
Well, just structurally, it's different. When I wrote my first Playhouse 90, I only did 2 of them. I realized it was a different form. It wasn't the 3-act form anymore. It was the 6-act form, and I had to write it the 6-act form. The show was called Project Immortality, which had been turned down twice by Playhouse 90. John Houseman had wanted to produce it for Playhouse 90, and Frank Schaffner wanted to direct it, and I had developed the script for them, actually the outline, not the script. And Hubble Robinson, who was head of programming there, had turned it down because there's one act of the 6 that's just a man doing math on a blackboard. And he said, no one's going to want to see that. And John and Frank finally gave up on it. And then when, just as Hubble Robinson was about to resign, he gave Peter Kortner, who was their story editor, the chance to produce 2 films, 2 Playhouse 90s. And Peter Kortner came to New York, and he asked me if I would do it for Playhouse 90. Project Immortality, because he had read the outline. In the meantime, I had written the script for Kraft, because Fielder Cook, who was working for Kraft, had gotten me to write the script on Kraft money. And then Kraft went off the air before I even finished the script. So
it was canceled?
Yeah, so I had the script, and Peter Kortner wanted to do it, and I said, only if Fielder Cook directs it. And Fielder was in trouble with CBS at the time because his previous Playhouse 90, called The Dingling Girl, had been a catastrophe. But anyway, I said, if Fielder can't direct it, then I'm not going to do it. And they accepted it. And that's how it got done.
Well, tell me about that show. What was it about?
It was about a mathematician who has done close to a genius. It's really based loosely on John von Neumann, if you know who he was. The first man to conduct a hearing of the Atomic Energy Commission entirely in Hungarian. He was a great mathematician and one of the men who created the first computer. And so what happened to von Neumann was when they found out he was dying, they sent someone to live the last few years of his life, the last few months of his life with him, picking his brain, because they weren't going to have it around much longer. And that's the situation that interested me. And Felix Jackson...
Why? What was it that interested you about that idea?
Because when a man or when a person faces the knowledge of how much time he has left, he has the opportunity to look at his life and decide whether this is what he wants to keep doing or do something entirely. You know, what he decides at that moment, I found a very interesting moment for a person to live through. And von Neumann just kept on doing what he was doing, which is what I wanted my guide to do too. Von Neumann, he had a brain tumor, and he was fluent in 5 different languages, and he also punned across languages. And they sent someone to pick his brain, and he could talk for about 20 minutes, and that he'd lose his ability to speak in that language. But if they switched to another language, he was fresh again for another 20 minutes in a different language, and they had to keep doing that. Well, anyway, that situation was the one I had of a mathematician who had been very important in linear programming and computer development, and the Pentagon finds he's dying, and they send some very calculating guy there to pick his brain, and it creates a family situation. The man has a wife, he has a son, he has a daughter, and this guy from the Pentagon comes in and intrudes on them, and what it is for the mathematician who first thinks, I'm going to teach this guy my set of values, and ends up being seduced by the younger man. And it's also about what computers can do and what computers can't do. And IBM gave us their newest computer in the studio. They only had 2 of them, and they insisted not having their IBM on the thing because they felt it was a script that was important as far as public understanding of computers. So they didn't want to appear to be capitalizing on it. So they took their thing off, and the power unit blew on the computer in the studio because of lights like these. And so they had their other one in New York, and they flew that one out for the show. It was really terrific. I said at the end it was probably closer to anything I've ever done to how I imagined it when I wrote it. I think Conspiracy beat that, but...
What was it about that production that you thought was really successful?
I thought it made the point. It made the point dramatically, and the structure, which was really weird, worked very well. I alternated acts, 1 act of action, 1 act of character, 1 act of action, 1 act of character, and it worked perfectly. And those people, I think, became very real.
And the star of it was Lee J. Cobb?
Yes. Impossible.
What is that? In what way?
He is an impossible man. He was an impossible man. There was one scene in the whole show that he didn't control as an actor. And he wouldn't play it. He kept saying, I need something different here. And we kept rewriting that scene, and it was never right. And then finally he said, I'll write the scene. So Fielder said, all right, you write the scene. He wrote that. Fielder took me aside and he said, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. He said, write the final version of the scene. He said, and just put it in your drawer. He said, Lee is going to knock down every version of it. he's going to write his own. He's finally going to say, this scene is shit. And then I'm going to give him the one you have in your drawer and saying, this is the one we're going to do. And that's exactly how it worked out. He had this powerful scene with Michael Landon, who played his son, who can't watch his father die and runs. And Cobb goes to find the son. And it's that confrontation. And it was Michael's scene. And Lee couldn't abide it. And later, the show was very successful. And afterwards, Lee learned that I had written a stage version of it. And he said he wanted to produce and direct the stage version and take it on the road.
And star in it?
Yeah. And I said no. Then he was in another show of mine, To Confuse the Angel, and he never spoke to me.
He was angry about that?
Oh, sure. But he saw that role differently than I did. I wrote in the piece in the Times that was published about the time the show went on the air.
This is To Confuse the Angel? You're talking about, or this is Project Immortality?
Project Immortality. That Lee had said to me, you know how I see this man? I see him as Jesus Christ. Well, if he saw him as Jesus Christ, it was not the character that I had written. I wrote a man who was arrogant and blinding himself to things that were going on in his family. I didn't think of him as Jesus Christ. The performance I got from him was pretty good. He only interpolated one line, which I hated in the script. He said, there's a nip in the air. I mean, I would have never written that line.
He improvised that. You were nominated for an Emmy.
Yes.
For that show. Were you surprised, pleased?
I was very pleased. And I also won the Sylvania for it, which at the time was like the equivalent of the Emmy.
The other Playhouse 90 you wrote, The Raider?
The Raider. It was based on, there were proxy fights going on wholesale in America about that time. I remember the one that destroyed the Pennsylvania Railroad station. And I wrote a story about a raider. Had to do a lot of research about it, but I wrote a story about a raider who wants to take control of a company, and the man who is running the company decides to fight him and fights him with the same tools the raider uses. And eventually, the company is destroyed, and you never find out who wins because it doesn't matter anymore. The prize is already gone, no matter who wins. So I ended it with the people voting, but you never find out who wins. And I remember Playhouse 90 got a long letter with this guy who said, I saw that show, I really loved it. I have a great story that would be perfect for you. And it was a very detailed story on both sides of the paper, and there was no ending. It just sort of went off the page. He was telling me that he was doing to me what I had done to him. That was Frank Schaffner and Herb Brodkin.
Tell me about the cast of that show and how they worked together.
That was tough. Rod Taylor was the young man coming up in the company. Frank Lovejoy was the man who had just assumed control of the company from the old man who had built the company, that was Donald Crisp. And Paul Douglas was the raider. And Paul Douglas was not well at that time. And he had a small bottle of vodka which he kept in something just outside the rehearsal room. And his energy levels would go way down, and he'd go out of the room for a minute, and then he'd come back in, and he's all full of vigor again, because he was getting drunker and drunker each day. And Lovejoy couldn't stand it. Lovejoy was taking the script to his psychiatrist every day and discussing what was going on. And he would come in the morning and he'd say, Frank, I have a few problems. And Frank would put his arm around him and they'd walk about for 45 minutes where Frank was being a psychiatrist to Frank Lovejoy. In the meantime, Paul Douglas would get angrier and angrier, and Rod Taylor, who was a friend of Douglas's, would get angrier and angrier. And we actually had a fist fight in that rehearsal. But it went on the air.
How did that get resolved? Did Schaffner bring everybody together? Or?
There were no handshakes. There were no handshakes. They did, professionalism finally has to hold it together. But it was tough.
Can you tell me briefly about the 2 DuPont Show of the Weeks you did?
That was about the Briggs robbery. And it was done documentary style. Perfect for Frank. There was only one woman in the show, and she had a very little part.
Franklin Schaffner, who
Yeah.
directed.
And I remember Paul Mazursky was one of the actors in it. The director, Paul Mazursky, writer and director, who, as a youth, had been a comedian, and he was very entertaining. I remember once we took a lunch break and we were walking to lunch, and Paul took Frank aside and said, "I've got something I have to confess to you." He said, "It's a problem." He said, "There's some man in this cast who is gay, and it's creating a real problem." And Frank said, "What kind of problem?" He said, "Well, he comes on." And Frank said, "Who is it?" He said, "Well, I can't tell you." And Frank said, "Well, you've told me this much. You got to tell me who it is." And Paul grabbed Frank, kissed him on the mouth, and said, "It's me, you fool." For Frank Schaffner, that was a real blow. I mean, this very staid man. Felix Jackson was the producer. I was threatened with a kind of a blacklist about that show because with my penchant for putting in my own attitudes, one of the robbers is electrocuted. He's executed. And it's just handled narration. It's not seen. But I insisted that the narrations say he was put to death electrically. I didn't want to just say electrocuted because you don't visualize anything when you hear that. I didn't want to use a standard term. I wanted to change the language just enough so that you could visualize him being electrocuted. Well, NBC did not want that language. And the man for DuPont, the liaison between NBC and DuPont was, what is his name? He was married to Mary Tyler Moore.
Grant Tinker?
Grant Tinker. And at one point, when I'd refused to make the change, I got a call from him. And he insisted that I change it. And I said, no. And he said, look, you're a young man. He said, you got this big career ahead of you. If I were you, I wouldn't do anything to damage it. And that sort of ended the conversation. And so what happened is Grant Tinker took it to DuPont. The problem, another problem, and this was worse than the language, was that the sheriff who had arrested 2 of these guys illegally arrested them, trumped them up, and kept them in jail until one of them died. Turned out he was the sheriff of a town that was a DuPont company town. And Tinker wanted me to change the town, and I wouldn't do that either. I said I took this on only on the condition that it be as accurate as possible. And once you start fictionalizing, then, nobody knows what they can believe and what they can't. Anyway, he took the whole thing to DuPont, and they said they didn't care at all. So it went on the way I wanted.
Were there other times where you faced censorship from networks or sponsors?
The only other time I can think of was in a CBS playhouse that I did called Shadow Game, where Daniel Massey is beaten up. It's a story that takes place during the blackout in New York in one of those tall office buildings, and he's going down the stairway, and there are marauders on those stairways, and he's set upon and he's beaten. And CBS insisted that in the subsequent scene, which was supposed to be right after he pulled himself together, he showed no signs of bruising. And I really got very upset at that. It made no sense. I said, if you're going to believe this, then you have to. If you're going to believe that he was hurt, you got to show him hurt. And the director, Paul Bogart, they did a sort of a compromise on that.
The second DuPont was called Ambassador at Large.
Yes, that was a show that was supposed to go on earlier, but stopped for a while because of the Kennedy assassination. Because it had to do with the State Department, and Frank was close to Kennedy. He had directed Kennedy's speeches, and the reference to the government, they just felt it was too soon, and so the show was delayed. It was really based on information we got from an ABC correspondent named John Scally, who found himself being used as intermediary between the State Department and the Russians in the missile crisis. And that's what it was about.
Who is Carl Miller? He made his debut around this time.
Carl Miller is a name that I made up. It had no relation to my own name because I didn't want to use my own name, and I had made that name up while I was still in college, when I was writing soap opera kind of stuff or silly stuff, and I didn't know what my career was going to be, and I didn't want to have my name floating around with stuff that might not be appropriate for the career that I'd chosen for myself.
And you used it on a Chrysler Theater?
Yes.
Why?
The late producer Berg.
Dick Berg.
Dick Berg. He solicited me to write it. It was supposed to be written by Eugene Burdick, and Burdick had written the outline, but then Burdick died. So they asked me to do the script, and I said I would. And we talked about the casting and everything, even, at the very beginning. We decided, it was Berg's idea. It would be a wonderful part for Henry Fonda. And I said, great, and I wrote the script in New York, and I sent it out to him. And he'd hired Stuart Rosenberg, and
to direct it.
Yeah, and Dick said, come on out, Stuart wants to talk about the script. And it had to do with the campaign manager and the old school, trying to run a campaign for a new school candidate. And so I go out, Stuart says, I had this great idea. He said, instead of having scenes with the candidate, we'll have the scenes all around the candidate, but we'll never see the candidate. And I thought that was a terrible idea. And we talked about it. We didn't come to any conclusions about it. I went back to New York. I tried to find a way to write it that way. It just simply didn't work at all. It didn't make any sense because you didn't know what was at stake for the person who had most at stake. So I said, if you don't want to do the script, I said, fine. I said, do it your way, and I'll use a pseudonym. And then I got a call from Dick Burkett. He said, no. He said, we talked about it. We think you're right. We're going to do the script the way you want it. I said, fine. And next time I heard from him, he said, well, we had our first day of shooting, and it's wonderful. I said, how's Henry Fonda? He said, well, we had this new idea. He said, it's not Henry Fonda. We didn't get Henry Fonda. I said, who did you get? He said, Milton Berle. And then I found out that they did the script that Stuart Rosenberg wanted. They didn't do my script at all. They just lied to me, and that's why Carl Miller is on the script.
What was the CBS Playhouse?
CBS Playhouse was a short-lived period of time when CBS returned to the long-form drama. It happened because NBC announced that they were going to do it. And so CBS, Mike Dan, who was head of programming then, he said, we can't let NBC do this, and we're not. So they invented this CBS Playhouse, which was going to be done out in California, the way they did the Playhouse 90s. And they hired Barbara Schultz to be the editor, and she started speaking to directors, and she spoke to George Schaefer and asked him what he wanted to do, and he said, Loring Mandel had written the script that Hallmark doesn't want to do, and that's the one I want to do, and that's how it got to be done.
Tell me the odyssey of that script, because you'd written that sometime before, right?
Yeah. Based on things I'd seen with my own parents about elderly people in homes that are sort of like greenhouses for people, taken out of society and left pretty much to vegetate. And it had been in my mind ever since the day I had to take my grandfather to a place like that when I was in the Army on leave. And George Schaefer was doing the Hallmarks, and Hallmark was having a script writing contest. They would pick a winning script every season to produce. And George asked me what I would like to do, and I wrote a one-page outline for him. And he said, I'll send it out to Fax Cone. That it's the man, the Foote Cone Belding in Chicago was the advertising agency for Hallmark. And Fax Cone liked it, and he took it up to Kansas City to show to the old man at Hallmark, Joyce Hall, who turned it down. And it got back to George, and George called me in and he said, Fax Cone turned it down, Joyce Hall turned it down. He thinks that every 70-year-old man ought to have his own greeting card company. And so we're going to pay you to write the script. And I'm sure that when he sees the script, he'll want to do it. So I wrote the script. I wrote it very fast in about 2 weeks because that material had been in me for so many years. And gave it to George, and George was very enthusiastic, and Fax Cone was very enthusiastic and took it up to Joyce Hall, and he turned it down again. So when Barbara Schultz called in George Schaefer and said, what would you like to do on CBS Playhouse? He said, I have this script. Loring has this script, and that's how it got done.
And what was the original title, and what was it then called?
I called it The Odyssey of Peter Sherman, the name of the major character. Barbara Schultz had another idea. She wanted to call it Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night. That was a problem because the Dylan Thomas estate had never let anyone use that title. But fortunately, I knew people at the Harold Ober Agency Harold Ober Agency represented the Dylan Thomas estate, and they let me use it. They've never let anyone use it since. But that's how it got the title.
And tell me about the production of that and the casting.
Well, I don't know how much you know about it. It was quite interesting. The leads were Frederick March and Florence Eldridge, and we went into rehearsal. George's rehearsals were broken down into 15-minute periods. I mean, the most organized rehearsals, which it's good because you get a lot done, but at the same time, it doesn't leave a lot of space for improvisation. But we rehearsed it, and Freddie March was so wonderful. He was so perfect. And then the actors struck. The television actors went on strike, and when we saw that coming, they had said, you could go ahead and tape the show, but you can't show it till the strike is over. So we finished our 2 weeks of rehearsal, and the day we were supposed to go in the studio, they came to the rehearsal hall and said, actors have to leave. We're shutting it down. So Freddie and Florence stayed in the Beverly Hilton Hotel, waiting out the strike. And it ended on a Friday, and Sunday, while they were rehearsing their lines in the hotel room, Freddie had a stroke and fell down, and Florence thought he was dead, and she had a heart spasm, and they were both lying on the floor, and they were found, and they ended up in the hospital, and we had an air date, and we were about to begin rehearsals, and we had no leads. And so George called Melvin Douglas and told him, Melvin was in Vermont or Maine, and he was snowed in. He said, get me the script. I have to see the script. And they couldn't get the script to him. And they finally made a deal. They would get the script to New York. If he can get to New York, he can read the script on the plane. And he said, well, I guess if it was good enough for Freddie, I guess it'll be good enough for me. And so he did fly out, and he came directly from the airport to CBS, and George and I had lunch with him. And he said, this is going to be hard. He said, it's perfect for Freddie. He said, it's the kind of person Freddie is. He said, it's so alien to me with his character, so alien to me, it's going to be a real stretch, but I'll do what I can. And they got Shirley Booth to play opposite him. And he was wonderful. He was wonderful, but he didn't think so. And the last day of shooting, I went to congratulate him, and he didn't want to hear it. He thought it was terrible, that he had been terrible. He'd never had the chance to actually run through the show from beginning to end nonstop. When they finally had it edited, they screened it in New York for the New York actors. And he wanted to see it, but he did not want to see it in the room with the other actors. And they had to sneak him into the building and show it to him in a different room because he was so certain he had done a bad job. And after the screening, he walked out and he made sure that he walked through all the rooms where the other actors were because he knew that he had done a good job, and he won the Emmy for it.
Now, did you have to make changes in the script to accommodate him?
No.
And how did you adjust from being involved in Frederick March and Florence Eldridge to the new casting?
Well, I had so many other things to worry about on that production because there were all matters of what the set looked like. I was involved in that, and I was involved in Shirley Booth, who I thought was a big problem.
Why?
I don't think she played the part well. I have a rule about actors who want to cry on camera. The more they cry, the less the audience does. And if you want the audience to cry, you want the actor not to cry. You want the actor to stop. It's the holding back that gives it the power. But she was very indulgent actress. And I remember sending a note to George during the filming of one critical scene where I thought she was over the top, and I didn't think that George was being tough enough on her, and I said, I think we want less Shirley and more Booth.
And how did he react to that?
George was a very congenial guy. I mean, he knew that that what I wanted was the same thing he wanted, the best show we could get.
But did he make that change with her performance?
He couldn't. She was a little out of control.
Well, you won an Emmy after all of that turmoil for
Yeah.
Do Not Go Gentle. Tell me, did you attend the ceremony?
Oh yeah. Sat at a table with Mike Dan, my wife and and Mike Dan and his wife, and I block on names. The fellow the creator of Mission Impossible.
Oh, Bruce Geller.
Bruce Geller and his wife. And there were very few CBS shows that won that year. And I remember after I won it, I got handed the award by 99, Barbara Feld. I was standing holding the Emmy and Mike Dan beside me while they were taking pictures, and he was muttering to me, "Saved by a writer, saved by a writer."
Do you remember what you said when you went up and received the Emmy?
I really don't.
Was there some idea you wanted to get at, some theme about aging in that show?
Oh, sure.
What was it?
Have you seen the show?
Yes.
Well, it's that you've got to be engaged with life as much as possible, as long as possible. I mean, there were people who were upset at the ending because the ending is a note of struggle between a father and a son. But that's the human condition.
Did being an Emmy winner change your professional status?
I don't know.
You mentioned briefly the other CBS Playhouse. You wrote Shadow Game.
Shadow Game.
Anything else you want to say about that show?
No, it was not a very successful show. I wanted it to be more surrealistic than it was, but Paul Bogart was not a surrealistic director, and so there was a flatness to it. It was. I became very fond of Doris Roberts, who was in it, who's done very well. And I remember the review came out the next morning in the New York Times, and it said the show lacked substance. And my older son was very upset at the breakfast table about it. And my wife was explaining, look, your father happens to be in the line of business where he gets reviewed, and there's, it's unfortunate that there are bad reviews sometimes and good reviews, and that's what you have to put up with. And Alan said, yeah, I understand all that, but couldn't you have just thrown in a little more substance?
We also mentioned To Confuse the Angel with Lee J. Cobb. What was that about?
To Confuse the Angel was a story that I had been wanting to write, based very loosely on my father. It was the first screenplay I wrote, and I wrote it entirely on spec for a theatrical film. And I never did anything with it. And then much later, a friend of mine who knew about it talked about it, and Alan Shane, who was a producer by then, he was still working for David Susskind, but he had been given the opportunity to produce. He said he wanted to produce it on a Prudential. It meant it had to be cut down from like roughly a 2-hour script to a 1-hour script, and we did. And he got Lee J. Cobb, and he got a director who had worked with Lee in the past and who had come to blows with him. So you could imagine what the reading was like, where Lee Cobb was throwing his bound script at the director, and the director was throwing his eyeglasses on the floor and stomping on them, and it was terrible. And Cobb wouldn't speak to me, and he wouldn't speak to the director. And I saw, after a couple of days, I saw no usefulness for me there, and I left. And then I got a call from Susskind saying, come for the dress. So I came for the dress, and I watched it, and I made my notes, and I gave them to the director, and the director said, what are these? I said, these are my notes. He said, what am I going to do with your notes? I can't even give him my notes. And he just, did his thing.
Do you remember who the director was?
If you had asked me a few years ago, I could have told you, but
No, that's all right. What was I remember?
he was retired. That director had been retired at the time. He was brought out of retirement to direct it.
What was I Remember Illinois?
This was a documentary I was asked to do. It was the like 150 years of the state of Illinois, and they wanted to do something about the state. The state wanted to pay for it. A producer in Chicago hired Harry Rasky, a documentary filmmaker, to do it, and they asked me to write it, and it was great. I mean, I got to meet and talk at length with people like Buckminster Fuller, and I reunited with Bob Hope and Jack Benny and all kinds of people who had some connection to Illinois.
Is being a Chicagoan and an Illinoisan, did that?
I think that's why, probably why I was picked.
Has that come up in your writing a lot?
No, I'm still a great booster for that city, although I'm practically never there. I think it's a wonderful city, and it was a great time in my life. I was acting on the radio in high school, and it was just a wonderfully exciting place for me. And I found New York to be sort of calmer than it was in Chicago.
Really?
Yeah.
All right, so around this time you're also working in daytime television a bit. How did that come about?
A man named Freddie Silverman, who was at the time head of daytime programming for CBS, decided that what the 4 CBS soap operas needed was prime time writing. So I was approached, see if I'd be interested, and I said, I don't know. I don't have any prejudice against it, it's a different style. But they asked me to look at all 4 of their shows and see if I could pick one that I would like to become head writer of. And I watched them, and I picked Love of Life. I said, it's in this mythical town of Rose Hill or something like that. I said, if someone put truth serum into the water supply, by the next morning there wouldn't be a plot line alive. That's really the way it was. So I thought I would try, and I started trying to write the characters, and I found that the way they spoke was, first, they were still speaking radio speak. If we were talking soap opera talk, I'd keep calling you Stephen, and everything I said to you, and you'd keep calling me Loring, so that the people who were listening on the radio would know who was talking. And I can't write that dialogue, and I didn't. I also found that what was traditional in soap opera was that scenes came to a climax, and just before the climax you got a commercial, and then you were in a different scene with different people. So the real climactic moments never got played.
I have to interrupt you for a second so we can change the tape.
Okay.